right. So our ground rules for ARVIC, I'm sure you've heard this a few times, but just for the new people that may be joining us, we are at the mercy of the tech, as we've all learned through the last 2.5 years. It can be a little finicky sometimes. So far, so good today, so I have high hopes. Second, always be respectful, not just of the person sharing or me, but of everybody. And please take this time to network, engage, interact, chat with each other, post on LinkedIn and Twitter and wherever you want using our hashtag ARVIC, but be respectful. That's all I ask. So we are going to hear today, or right now, from Alex Strauss with Roku. He's the Consumer Insight Specialist. And I specifically chose this one because I write a lot of surveys, Alex. So
awesome.
We're going to learn about leveraging user data for smarter surveys. And you can go ahead. I'll stop sharing, Alex, and you can do your thing.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to take everyone through this today. Let's just make sure. Am I sharing the user screen or am I sharing the full screen?
I see your screen.
Okay.
Oh,
great.
no, we see there you go. There's full screen.
Okay, great. Today we're going to talk through, obviously sending email surveys is nothing new to the world of research, but a step we've taken at Roku is really building a bridge between our behavioral data, our log data of what Roku users are doing, and helping that to make our surveys smarter, more effective, and more efficient. And I'm going to go through how we built that program and kind of some ground rules and watch outs as you go along that process of integrating your data into surveys. So just starting off with a little bit of background around me, I've been in insights for 10 years after college. I really didn't have a direction. I didn't know where I wanted to end up, but a colleague or a friend of a friend recommended me to Holland Partners. So I started on the agency side, and I really found insights such a great space to be in, such a great combination of leveraging kind of creativity with data. And I feel like I've kind of run with this sense as it's like a perfect marriage of my skill set. And so after being on the agency side for about 5 years, I switched over to client side with a real focus on like understanding streaming and digital media. So I was initially at a company called Whistle Sports that really focused on making social media content around sports for a Gen Z audience. And then from there, I went to ESPN, focusing on the ESPN Plus product and helping to do content development and product development for that product. And now I'm at Roku for the last 1.5 years, focusing on the Roku channel, as well as some burgeoning sports initiatives we're working on at Roku as well. But for those that don't know the Roku channel is Roku's free ad-supported streaming service that's available on Roku devices, but also in some other locations like Amazon Fire devices and Samsungs and things like that. But since I've gone to the client side, I've really had an amazing opportunity to build out the survey research program and help to build that bridge of connecting data that we have both on these digital properties like ESPN Plus as well as the Roku channel to our survey data. So that's what we're going to go through today. So we'll start off by just talking about like what's the value, why do we add our behavioral data into surveys, and how does it benefit us? And then I'll kind of go stepwise through that process of just like kind of building that program out from scratch. How do you even set it up? And then once you've built that framework, what is that life cycle? How do you go through, integrating the data as well as sending out the survey? And then we'll wrap up with some kind of key watch outs of things I've learned through this process that, as you may be going through this process yourself, it's good to keep in mind. So the first thing to cover off is in today's world, so many brands have so much more data than they had on their customers than ever before. And it's important to not let that data go by the wayside. And so a lot of companies are building out really robust analytics and data engineering teams to help mine this data and come up with insights. And so obviously Roku, as a digital first platform, we have a tremendous amount of data on what people are watching, where they're going, the features they're using, as well as just when they build an account, you just have some basic identifiable information like their name, their email, their age, things like that. But it's this hugely valuable repository of data that you want to really take advantage of. And while Roku is inherently in the digital space, I think across the industry now, we do see like Delta Airlines, for example, as a brand I worked with in the past, they have data on their flyers, and even like, fast food brands like Jersey Mike's, they know, like if you're buying online, they know what sandwich you ordered last week and how often you're coming in. Within the space now, there's so much data, and it's important that we as survey researchers are not just reliant on our emails and our surveys to collect data, but to tap into this huge wealth of resources. And so you tapping into this resource can help to solve for a lot of the common issues that we see with online surveys. So just to kind of cover off, probably none of this is new to anybody, but it's good to kind of reinforce some of these common issues that we see in survey research. One is that, if we're trying to go after a small audience or a targeted audience, you can hit very low incidence rates, and if you're using a sample provider or things like that, your CPI can shoot up and it can become a very expensive study, or it can just be really hard to tap into that audience. And then also within the surveys, we always are trying to make our surveys as short and efficient as possible to maintain users' attention spans and make sure they're highly engaged throughout the survey. And when we're writing these surveys, oftentimes, you have to have a long screener, or you have to ask a number of behavioral questions to validate that you're talking to the right person and understand what they're doing. So it limits the amount of perceptual questions that you can ask to your respondents. And then lastly, when you're asking these behavioral questions in a survey, you're relying on claimed response. And so you're relying on someone to ask, like, how many shows have you watched in the last month, or how many flights have you taken in the last year? And most of us can't remember what we had for lunch yesterday. So how, whenever we're relying on these behavioral data points, it's hard for the respondents and us to rely on the data that they're giving us in those claimed questions. So by integrating user data, we're able to solve for a lot of these key pain points that we see in user research. So, going after these small targeted audiences, by knowing exactly the behavior that we want to go after, we can target users who have engaged with that behavior in our database and send this email directly to them to make sure that we're not wasting sample, or that we're not sending emails to people that we think may have done the action. We're sending emails to people that we know have taken that action. So it makes surveying and targeting a lot more efficient. Also, by appending behavioral data on the back end of our surveys, it really helps to reduce the number of questions that you need to ask of the respondent in the survey or in your screener that are behavioral questions. And in doing so, that really helps you to free up more space to ask those deeper perceptual questions that are really, I think the value of survey research is to get at that why. Why are you doing the behavior you're doing? And by not having to ask those behavioral questions, now you have the space in your survey to ask those deeper prodding questions and get at that why, which is really, really valuable. And then the last one, which I think is frankly like maybe the biggest value of doing this, is now there's no longer that reliance on claimed response, because we know exactly how many streaming hours that you spent on the platform in the last month, or we know exactly which shows you watched on the Roku channel, and we don't have to kind of speculate of like, oh, they said they did this, did they in fact do that? And so I see this email survey program as a part of your toolkit, but that doesn't mean that it can replace your entire survey program at any brand. There's things that it's really good for, and there's things that it's not as good for. So I just wanted to kind of highlight a few of the great use cases we have at Roku, as well as some of the things that we don't rely on this type of research for. I think one of the big distinctions is like from a retention standpoint versus acquisition. So like if you're looking at how to maximize engagement among your users and like understand which behaviors, drive them to kind of stay on your platform more often, it's really great to contact them for those reasons. We actually conduct our tracker. We conduct our brand tracker for the Roku channel by sending out email surveys and capturing user satisfaction. And then for like on-platform marketing effectiveness, is like driving people in to watch different shows. We can target people that have been exposed to, for those who are familiar with Roku, there's always that big banner ad on the side of your screen. And so we can look at people who are exposed to those types of creatives and understand what kind of impact that had on their consideration of the brand or the service. It's also a really great testing ground for new products and features. You have this core user base that's at your disposal, and you can understand like what types of features are they interested, like what is their desired experience to help inform features to design in the future. So it really is like a great test and learn space to help develop and improve your product. And then the last really great opportunity within this is, our behavioral and analytics teams are doing a lot of work in segmenting users based on behaviors, but obviously that attitudinal piece or that perceptual piece is a big part of that as well. So leveraging both the behavioral and attitudinal segmentation, it's a really great opportunity to tap into different types of users across your database and understand the mindsets that they have, in our case about streaming, but for whatever industry you're in, it can also be valuable to tap into the mindsets within that industry. And kind of where it doesn't make sense is acquisition marketing. So if you're doing marketing off platform, if you're doing marketing on TV or different touch points that aren't within your product set, it can be, obviously it's not going to be able, you're not gonna be able to contact the people that you touched with all those different campaigns. And then the other one is just understanding your competitors, right? It's not great for us to understand Fire TV users or Apple TV users within this methodology. If we want to understand why someone's buying a competitive device at Roku, we have to employ different methodologies to get at that competitive mindset and where we might be winning or losing versus our key competitors. So first, let's start from scratch. How do you build out this program, and how do you kind of get to this place where you have a nice quick funnel of targeting and accessing these users and appending the survey data? And so as with any new initiative, and as Amanda referenced on hers, it's a very collaborative process that like you really need to tap into a lot of different teams to kind of make this come to life. So we'll go through each one, but for us at Roku, we've had to work across a number of different teams to employ this program. So our data and analytics team is key about linking the data. Also it's our data engineering team, data privacy teams are also involved as far as like building out these mechanisms and making sure data stays secure. So there can be a lot of people on that side of the coin that are required. And I'd say those are probably your most key partner in making this program come to life. The next team that you need to work with is your CRM or marketing team, as far as sending out these communications, making sure they stay on brand, things of that nature. Maybe not the most exciting part, but also equally important is you definitely need to be in touch with your legal teams to make sure you're compliant with, again, privacy concerns, as well as, making sure that verbiage and things like that is all compliant and with kind of the requirements that are set within the company. And then last of all is your research vendors, whether you're working with self-serve platforms like a Qualtrics or a full service vendor, setting up a really strong relationship. And again, that data privacy is a really big component of building a successful relationship there. So when it comes to data analytics, as I mentioned, like that is the key bridge to making these programs come to life. And they're going to be your key partner both at setting up, but as well like throughout the entire process. And it's important to have a really collaborative relationship with these partners to make sure that everything's working in efficient and the right order. So the first thing you need to do is to build a connection to the data. You need some way to access the data. And so, at Roku, we have two different ways that we're accessing the data. we can tap into the database using SQL code, or we have a data management platform, otherwise known as a DMP, that's more of a self-serve tool that is also used for a lot of our ad campaigns, but we tap into that resource as a way to pull sample as well. But getting to that place is an important step to get there. So, you know, either building a DMP, which obviously going to take a lot on the data engineering side, or just having a way to tap into that database data is a really like the first step to get there. The next is just understanding what's available to you. What do we know about our consumers, and what data can we leverage to talk to our consumers and target them, as well as the format that it's in. You know, sometimes like some of this data is not the prettiest, and in order to make it usable for you as a researcher and make it translatable for your stakeholders in the end, it's important that we understand how the format, how the data is being collected, and how it's made available to you. Another like baseline thing that again, your analytics team is the one that's going to be responsible for this, but is a really key important part about maintaining user privacy is having a generic ID associated with each individual user of your brand, so that you're not relying on PII to contact or like kind of to pull that individual user. So at Roku, we call it account ID, very simple. At ESPN, there was another name for it that is across the Disney org, but is it just a unique identifier to identify your users. And then, you know, once you've built that connection to the data, you just have to figure out what's the best way to pull these lists of users from the database to use for email surveys. So as I mentioned, we have the two pathways, but you know, the first one is using SQL code to query our database. And I don't know how many researchers out there know SQL code. I'm not one of those. So I need to build a partnership with my analytics team and a contact there to help me to pull to query the database and use that SQL code to pull these lists. I am getting better at SQL, but still not proficient enough to do it all on my own. And then also just figuring out how to leverage that self-service tool. What are the things that you would need in a DMP to be able to pull those lists? In our instance, you know, it's a little bit more high level. So when we don't have quite as targeted of surveys or need quite as much data about our respondents, it's a really great tool to just quickly pull a sample and not burden our analytics team. So that there's kind of these two pathways, and I don't think most companies would need both, but you do need one of these like as a viable tool that you can rely on, and that's not going to be a heavy lift for all parties involved every single time that you want to pull a survey. So then with the CRM marketing team, there's a lot of considerations here, and it does vary by company. You know, my experience at ESPN versus my experience at Roku have been very different in this regard, and I'll call it the key differences there. But you need to really understand the rules for sending out an email. You know, this is consumer-facing communication, and it's important that it matches the brand of, you know, your brand, that it matches the tone and the language that, and kind of the sentiment that all communications that come from the company have, so that everything, you know, syncs up with users' expectation of what you're going to get from an ESPN or a Roku or things like that. And then the last really key thing you need to understand from CRM marketing is how often are you allowed to send the surveys. So that's actually one of the big distinctions about my experience at ESPN versus at Roku. At ESPN, we had to slot into their email program. So, you know, they had set communications of like, you know, we send sports updates, game updates on this day. We send, you know, broader information about the product or deals on this day. And, you know, you can have these slots to send out your email survey. So I was very limited at ESPN as far as the frequency with which I could send surveys. At Roku, our email program operates a little bit more independently of our CRM team. They've helped us to build up the pathway, but we send our emails separate from our CRM team at this point. And because of that, you know, we just maintain a 3-month exclusion so that no user of Roku is getting a survey more than once a quarter. So it's just a matter of maintaining a good user experience in that regard by just making sure that no one's getting burdened by getting a survey in their inbox from Roku every single week. So that is kind of, I think, as you're finalizing this program, is the main thing you need to figure out and kind of get sign off on is can you send the survey yourself via like a self-service platform like we use Qualtrics here, or does every single email need to be sent out by your CRM team? And confirming which pathway you're going to go down is probably going to be based on the comfortableness of your CRM and marketing teams. And then, as I alluded to, maybe not the most exciting or fun part of the process, but legal is a really key component in setting up this type of program to make sure that you're not overstepping any rules and like not using any language that could be harmful to the company. So soup to nuts, almost when you're setting this up, almost every single thing needs to be approved by legal. In most instances, you want to set it up so that not everything needs to be cleared in the future. So getting standardized questions that are approved, getting standardized email language that are approved, understanding what data you can and cannot use in the surveys or to contact people are important. Understanding parameters on who you can contact. So at Roku, we don't talk to anyone under the age of 18. It's a very strict policy that we can't contact anyone who's under the age of 18. And then also, if you're sending any surveys internationally, you have to understand that there's varying data policies and the ways that you can contact people internationally. So making sure that you're compliant with international policies like GDPR are also really essential as well. And then there's other dynamics based on specific types of surveys you might be sending. If you're including a sweepstakes in your email survey, you need to work with legal to set up terms and conditions. If you're doing new product research or concept testing of things that have not launched yet, you need to set up an NDA with your legal team to make sure that those users that you're sending these surveys to are not going to be disclosing any sensitive information. And then as well, like as far as setting up relationships with your research vendors, you need legal to be involved to make sure that privacy terms are set up with them. And so I do reference that again here. When you're setting up with your research vendors, if you're working with a survey platform like Qualtrics or something like that, you need to build a secure link to be able to upload your sample files and make sure that emails and other personal information is not being compromised. And then once the data is on those platforms, most of them do have really strong encryption and data policies, but it's important that those are compliant with your own internal policies as well. And then if you're working with a research agency on these types of setups, you really want to make sure that you're setting up some type of NDA or data privacy agreement so that if you're sending emails to a person on the other side of the agency, that they're in agreement and compliant with the policies of protecting that data. And there's been no shortage of data breaches and leaks in the world in the last few years. And as a researcher, I don't think we ever want to be the ones that are responsible for that data getting out there. So ensuring that those policies are set up and that users' data is not getting leaked is obviously of the most paramount importance. So before I dig into kind of like the survey lifecycle, I wanted to open up, see if there's any initial questions, and if not, then we can kind of proceed with the actual employment of the emails.
If you have any questions, you can type them up in the Q&A or in the chat, and I will forward them on to Alex. So far, there's no questions.
No problem.
I have a question for you.
Of course.
In working with the other aspects of or the other teams that you have to work on in order to use internal and external data, have you ever run into any problems being able to do that?
I mean, really the only problem I'd say, which isn't really a problem, is just making sure you're compliant, is I've had our legal team say no, you can't ask that, or no, you need to change the wording on this before you send it out. So really the only problem is making sure that you're compliant with all of the rules and regulations and the legalese, if you will, that like most of us aren't completely privy to. So we can in our heads think, oh yeah, I think that's fine. But then there are some times where you're like, oh, maybe I towed too close to that line, and kind of get maybe a slight hand slap, say maybe change the wording on that one. So I think that's really the only issue I've run into. The other one, I guess, is working with your analytics team. I've had a much more collaborative experience at Roku. I actually have someone on my team that helps me to pull a lot of these sample files and is very well versed in the data. At ESPN, I didn't have necessarily like more of like a dedicated relationship with someone, and so pulling the data files and knowing what was available was like a little bit more challenging, or it was a little bit harder to do that on an ongoing basis. So just like making sure that you've like built that really strong relationship with your analytics team and working hand in hand with them is something that like can potentially be an issue, but like if you build a good relationship, can pay huge dividends as far as like creating a more efficient process.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. Still no questions, so if you want to.
All right, we'll keep buzzing along then. So now we've set up our process, we're good to go. We're ready to start sending some surveys. But obviously there's a lot of steps to make that happen. And I've kind of broken it down into 4 components here, and we'll go through each one. So the first step is identifying the people that you want to talk to and pulling them from your database. And this is where a lot of your data work is going to be done, and a lot of your work with the analytics team is going to be done. It's actually really great to be more proactive in this step and really identify all of the data you're going to need, so you don't have to kind of keep going back to that well throughout the process. And then once you start programming a study, just like building that connection so that your survey responses are tied to your behavioral data, as well as you're also just protecting all of the personal identification information in there, is also a really important part of setting up this process. And then you send out your emails. You have to make sure that, again, you're complying with the right terminology and contacting people in the right way. And then on the back end is I always think the most fun part is doing that analysis, is like taking your survey results, combining them with that behavioral data to really build out a holistic picture and tell a really compelling story of, you know, the what and the why pulled together. And I think that, you know, that's kind of the big like selling part of this proposition, is to be able to tell that deeper story by not just showing like this is what people say, but also like this is what people do, and how those relate is really where kind of you provide value for your stakeholders. So up front, when you're identifying respondents to pull, you want to be doing this in like the very beginning of your survey research process. So as you're developing your survey and writing the survey, you know, that's when you really want to start to pull together what's the spec going to be of like who's your targetable audience and how are you going to contact them. So you want to work with your stakeholders to define audience parameters that are going to meet the business needs and the business questions for that specific product. So, you know, a good example is, you know, we did a survey. We recently on the Roku channel launched an Espacio Latino, a zone dedicated to Spanish language content. So we wanted to contact people that were both already using Spanish language content on the Roku channel, as well as people more broadly across the Roku platform that we had seen had a propensity to use or watch Spanish content. So in that instance, we were considering the users that were doing that behavior, as well as users that we want to do that behavior on the Roku channel in the future. And so understanding like that full gamut of your audience is really going to be important at this stage in the process. The other thing is that, you know, while you want to create a really targeted criteria of who you're contacting, you want to make sure that it's broad enough so that you can pull in enough people to contact. We'll get into the details of it, but you do need to contact a lot of people. You need to send a lot of emails to get enough responses to your survey. So, you know, I don't want to look at people who watch John Wick on Thursday between the hours of 6 and 8 p.m. because I probably don't have enough people, but I can look at, since we launched John Wick a month ago, how of all the people that have watched John Wick this month, you know, can I ask them a survey about, you know, why they were watching that specific program on the Roku channel. So I think it's making sure you have like realistic parameters and you're not really digging into this specific tactile example that may or may not be feasible to contact. And then when you're pulling the audience, it's important to be proactive and think about all the data that you're going to want on the back end as well. So, there's kind of like two components here. It's like, who do you want to talk to? And then what do you want to know about them? And so in doing that, I think the best way to think about that is like, what are the behavioral questions that you would ask in the survey? Like, how frequently are you using the Roku channel? Or, how do you enter the Roku channel? What types of ads were you exposed to on the Roku channel in the last few weeks? And then figure out, like, those are the types of questions I'm going to ask. Could that data be available to me? Is that things that I could append to my sample files that I don't have to ask in my survey? So once you've kind of gone to that well, then you figure out, like, what do I have and what is available and how is it formatted? So if I one of the things I ask is like, how much did you use the Roku channel last month? That data might be available as a raw count in seconds or minutes or hours. So you want to figure out, how is that data formatted and how do you need it to be formatted for you to be valuable in your survey? So, in the instance of, like, if I want to know how many hours someone spent on the Roku channel last month, I generally like to have that bucket into 3 tiers of, like, a low, medium, high user. And so instead of having this raw count of streaming hours, I'll actually bucket it into 3 different buckets of streaming hours to kind of get that low, medium, high user. And that's a lot easier for me to use in my analysis. And it's also going to be a lot easier to do up front. So really thinking proactively here and appending your data on the front end is going to be super valuable to set up your program, and also to make sure you have everything available. And also, your analytics team is definitely going to thank you in this instance, because they're going to only have to do one data pull for you instead of having to kind of go back and append data on the back end of your survey. So it's really good to kind of think through that full approach as you're setting up the survey. And then also, just the last note here is, as you're pulling in this data, really only include PII that's absolutely required. You don't want to be pulling in name and address and maybe date of birth you might want if age is important for your survey. But really, like, if email is what you need to contact the people, that's going to be your essential. Beyond that, you probably just want to focus on, like, more of this, like, obfuscated or, like, more just behavioral data that's not like personally identifiable, just to make sure that you're not interfering with any data policies. And so once you've pulled your sample, now it's a matter of getting the list to your platform or to your survey vendor to set it up. So one path there is to just make sure that data is protected along the way. And the main thing is that, again, we don't want like any data leaks happening, and we don't want data ending up out there in the ether. So really, like, email should never touch your local device. So you have to figure out a secure pathway, whether that's using, you're like, we use Microsoft SharePoint here, but that's a cloud protected platform, and it's encrypted. So, we download our files directly to there, and they don't actually end up touching our machine. And then from there, they go directly from our encrypted cloud platform straight into the survey platform through a connection with Qualtrics. So the emails never touch our device. And that's super important, because you don't want, God forbid, your computer gets stolen while you're in the process of this, and now there's like users' data on your computer. So really making sure that process of getting the list from your data provider, your database, to your sample platform where you're going to send the emails from, it's really important that you're protecting your data throughout there. And then when it comes to setting up, I think the biggest, this only works and it's only valuable if you're setting up a connection between your survey data and the behavioral data that you captured. So you want to make sure, whether you're using something like Qualtrics or using a sample vendor, that they see the behavioral data in your file and how it's connected to the respondent, and that when you're programming a study, that data connection will be built so that your survey responses are in line with someone's behavioral data. So in Qualtrics, it's called building embedded data fields. In other platforms, maybe called something else, but you want to make sure that those are properly set up so that there's this even connection between your data and your survey response. And then, as I alluded to, as you're pulling this list, you also want to make sure that you're maintaining a really strong exclusion list, especially if you're not the only person at your company. At Roku, we have almost like 40 or 50 researchers that are all pulling lists for their surveys. And so it's very possible that users could end up getting surveys sent to them on a very frequent basis. And so you want to make sure every time you're pulling this list that you have a good process of updating your database with some type of flag to make sure that it's known exactly when this person was last contacted for a survey, so that nobody's getting bombarded and creating a negative brand experience. Because if you, that's the fast track of setting your CRM or marketing team, if they're finding that like all these people are unsubscribing from Roku emails because they got 10 surveys in the last 3 weeks. So in maintaining that exclusion list is also a really important part to maintain a great user experience for all the users across the platform. So we're working our way through it, and so we've pulled our list, we've set up the survey program, and we're ready to send out the email. And so to do that, setting up the email, there's a few steps that we take here. So first of all, we just have a standard email template that we use that maximizes survey response. So we've done this by doing an iterative approach where we've tested and learned on kind of like almost A/B tested our own like research on research, so where we ask, we tested different subject lines, we tested different from emails, we tested different survey bodies to get to an optimal format where we see the highest response rate. And one of the key things that we found in doing this testing is that consistency is king, regardless of who you're sending this survey to, which type of targeted audience. I've even found, even when targeting a Spanish speaking audience, that just having I actually saw a higher response rate for a just English survey than when I did an English and Spanish survey, email, I'm sorry. So you really want to make sure that like consistency is key and that you've established an ideal email format that's really going to maximize your response. And that's really important because typically our response rate's between 1% and 2%. So as I referenced before, like you don't want to pull a very small survey population because or targeted audience, because you're going to need a lot of people to get the amount of response you want. So in our typical survey where we want to get around 1,000 responses, we're pulling 100,000 people for a list to make sure that we get proper response. And so I understand, like Roku, we obviously have the great opportunity where there's 60 million Roku accounts. So there's plenty of people to pull from, but your user base may not always be so large. And so another way to maximize your response rate and make the most of your sample and potentially lower the amount of sample you need to pull is incentives. And so if you're going to include some type of incentive or sweepstakes program, in setting up the email, that's something you'll want to clear with legal. And there's multiple things. There's just setting up a standard terms and conditions, but other things you need to consider in setting up a sweepstakes program is how do you buy the prizes? How do you deliver the prizes? How do you select who wins the prizes? All of those things need to be regimented processes. So there's no impropriety, or that there's no chance that, consumers can feedback and say this was unfair or this, went in the wrong way. So it's important to kind of maintain each of those processes when you're building it up. And then for international studies, and in particular, if you're setting up a sweepstakes, you need to understand if different policies vary. So in Europe, there's much more stringent policies on the amount that you can give out in a sweepstakes, where it becomes then, I forget exactly the term they use, I think it's like a lottery or something like that, but you can have to limit the amount that the prizes are, and they have to be delivered in a certain way. So you also want to make sure that those are factored in for international studies. And then the last part here is, when you're contacting these users, I've obviously spoke all the virtues of appending this behavioral data, but at the end of the day, you can't be 1,000% reliant on the behavioral data to supplement your survey questions, you do need to do some validation to make sure that you're talking to the right person. So when we're, especially I think the way to make this kind of translatable for Roku is, we have account IDs. So if you have a Roku account, it's associated to your TV or your device that's in your household, there's one account per household, but that doesn't mean there's one person in your household that's watching Roku. So, if we see that that account has watched John Wick in the last month, and we want to talk to people who watch John Wick, we need to make sure that the person that's receiving the survey is the person in the household that watched that show, because it's possible that, the mother is the one that owns the account in the household, but the teenager was actually the one that watched John Wick, and in which case the insight that we're trying to gather is not valuable by sending it to that email person. So it is still important to validate for your core behaviors that you're targeting the survey on, that you still ask that question. So we slim down the amount of behavioral questions, but we don't eliminate them completely. So you still want to ask about those core questions that are important for confirming that's the type of people you're talking about. And there's also things like if you're trying to confirm that they use another part of the app. So like in the instance of, when we launched Espacio Latino, we targeted Hispanic users, but if we also wanted to look at the people as a subset in the survey of those that engage with Espacio Latino, we also want to make sure they recall that behavior, because even if they did this behavior, perhaps they don't recall it. And if they don't recall it, it's not very valuable to capture that feedback, as they're just going to be speculating. It also is another good valuable check to understand which experiences that people are having are explicit and they recall doing that versus implicit, like you were just clicking around and doing things, but you didn't actually internalize that behavior and it wasn't an impactful experience. So it kind of gives you two levels of insight there, which can also be really valuable. And then the last thing that can happen is like you do still want to ask a handful of behavioral questions, because if you don't, making that inference of like, oh, we know that you watched John Wick on Tuesday at 8 p.m. In your living room, people are gonna think that's a little bit creepier. They might think it's kind of Big Brother. So like just making those inferences in your survey or even in your emails, saying like, we saw you watch John Wick, take this survey about John Wick. Like those types of inferences can come off as intrusive to respondents, and you don't want to kind of create negative experiences in that way. It's okay that, there's a generic path to insert the email. And then there's also, that confirmation when it, like, which of these movies have you watched on the Roku channel? And, we'll see that, 75 or 80% of those people who we know did watch John Wick will say they watched John Wick. And then we can go from there and look at the people that actually recall doing that behavior. But we haven't like made that inference for them. So I think that's it's an important distinction to make, and it's an important kind of step in making sure you're creating a really great consumer experience. And then not to beat a dead horse on protecting data, but once you get to the analysis, that's another step where you really want to make sure that you're not compromising the data you have, because now you've added even more data on these users, and you don't want to kind of show even more, like make even more data about your users available. So once you've collected your survey responses, and you now need to take them down to Excel to do analysis, or now you need to upload them to a reporting software, you want to make sure that, again, the emails aren't hitting your computer. So when your vendor is sending you the files back, or when you're downloading things from Qualtrics, that you're removing, like now you don't need any emails anymore. That shouldn't matter at all. So when you're downloading these files, make sure that you've now removed all that personally identifiable information, and that's, again, not touching your computer. So it's kind of on the front end and the back end, you just want to make sure that you're protecting user data, because that's the most important part of this process. And then I said we want to be proactive on the front end, but sometimes we don't always have all the anticipation of every single data point that we're going to need. So in the instance where now you need to go back to your analytics team to append additional data points that you hadn't anticipated on the front end, if you're sending that file back to your analytics team, you want to make sure that they're going to be marrying that data based off that generic account ID that I referenced, as opposed to marrying off email, because that again is just a more secure way to build that bridge. It also, I think, usually for our analytics teams, it's easier to connect the data based on the account ID than it is on email anyway. So it's just just a better way to do the process. So we've made it through the whole process. We've kept our data secure, and now we have this amazing data set of survey data as well as behavioral data that we can dig into and create some really great analysis on. And so the first thing we want to do is applying weighting, and weighting is really important when you're doing these types of studies, because you want to make sure that you're presenting data that's representative of your user population. And so it's important to identify kind of key benchmark behaviors. Our standard one that we use at Roku is just platform streaming hours, how many hours they've spent on the Roku platform in the past month. But using like kind of these benchmark behaviors to make sure, and the age is another one that you can really use to make sure it's representative of your like demo composition, but you want to make sure that it's representative of your entire user base. And sometimes when filling out survey responses, you know, the respondents can skew away from what's a representative mix. So there's two ways that you can go about, you know, making sure that the composition is right. The first one is working with your analytics team to understand of this full population that you use, of all the John Wick viewers, how often were they streaming on the platform in the past month, and pull every single John Wick viewer and understand of the, say, I don't know, making up a number, but say 1 million users, of those 1 million people that watched John Wick, how many stream this much, how many stream that much, how many stream that much. That's going to be your most like ironclad method to come up with composition. But the easier kind of cheap way to do it is if you pulled out a list of 100,000 people, you can go and 1,000 people filled out your survey. You can go back to your 100,000 people and just look at the behavioral data there and say, of that 100,000, you know, streaming hours fell out this way, that way, and that way. And by just looking at that group, 100,000 is still going to be very representative of your platform. That's a huge sample size. So you can just leverage that and build your weights off of the composition of that 100,000 to make sure that your 1,000 people that answered is representative of the 100,000 you sent the email to. And so once you've done that, now you can really feel confident that your survey responses represent that entire streaming or product population. Another really important thing when you're conducting this analysis and kind of in this phase is you should be using your behavioral variables that you've appended as filters and not findings. And the reason that's important is because ideally your analytics team is doing all the analysis on behavioral data. They're going to know at scale, you know, like this many people used Espacio Latino this month and they use this many streaming hours. So there's no sense in reporting out that data in your survey because you're only going off the 1,000 people that answered your survey where they have the full universe of data. But it is valuable to say, of the people that used Espacio Latino, they're more likely to feel that way compared to the general population. So like leveraging those behavioral variables you have as a way to cut your data and understand those people that had this behavior were more likely to say this is where you can really drive meaningful analysis and help to add context where just looking at the data, you may not understand how people feel. And then just the last call out to, again, on the privacy space is that never really look at a respondent level. You shouldn't be kind of looking across line. You should be looking like down the column in the sense that you should be looking in aggregate of like, of all the people that said this and had that behavior, this is how they feel. Not like this person who streamed 10 hours last month, he also said that he really liked the experience. So it's important to kind of look in aggregate and not at a user level. Of course, if you ask an open-ended question and you wanted to grab a really great quote from that open-ended question to add some fun context on your slide, then yeah, of course, I think that's totally fine. You also probably shouldn't be saying that person is this person, that. Like, you know, George from St. Louis said this, but at least having that quote in there can obviously provide more context to your to your presentation. So that's the whole process of setting up this program. I wanted to share a few learnings that I've had in doing this at multiple companies, as far as kind of things to keep an eye out for, and things to make sure that you're controlling for when you're doing this. So the first one is response bias. When you're sending out these surveys, you can't, because especially if you're not incentivizing, the people that answer your survey from an email may skew away from your general population. So the main issue that we see at Roku, and that we solve for, you know, through managing quotas and weights and offering incentives, is that the people that answer email surveys skew older. If you're 18 to 24 and you get an email from Roku asking to answer a survey, you're a lot less likely to answer that survey than someone who's 65. And so you just want to make sure that, again, representativeness is key, and that you're taking measures to balance that and be representative of your general population as much as possible. So incentives helps. We're actually running a number of incentive tests right now to understand which different formats of sweepstakes or value of prizes drives both better response rates as well as improved composition across ages. So if you want to follow up with me on LinkedIn in a few weeks, I can probably share some results or guidelines on how that worked out. But it's important to kind of take those measures to make sure that you're getting a representative sample. And then another really important thing in response bias is to figure out, you know, that those who you have available, who have accounts, may not be all of your users. So in the instance of Roku, you know, you can access the Roku channel on the web at rokuchannel.com, but you don't have to sign in to watch content on that website. So of our web users, only a portion of them have accounts. So if we're reporting web usage data and web user perceptions based on people we contact with the account, we have to factor in that some of the people that are watching on web were out of our usage of our sampling set, and they may have varying perceptions, especially if, you know, creating an account is a sign of higher engagement. It's important that you're reflecting on that and making sure that, you know, you're caveating that the users that you have in your survey may be higher engaging users. Like if thinking outside the Roku realm, like if Jersey Mike's, like if you have an online account and you order sandwiches online half the time, then the other half the time you go into the store and you buy different sandwiches, then, you know, you may not like understand all the sandwiches that person's buying, or things like that. So it's important to kind of factor that in to know who exactly you're talking to, and that there's maybe a portion of users who you are missing in doing these surveys. And then I alluded to this one earlier, but important to kind of reference again, is that, you know, you have to understand if your user base is at an account level or at a user or one-to-one user level, and making sure that you know and you validate that the person you're talking to is the one that conducted the behaviors that you have appended to that user is really important. At some companies, you're going to have that one-to-one relationship. But in the instance of Roku, or frankly any other streaming company, it's hard to understand, or there's that level of differences that could be happening between an account level and a user level. So it's important to factor that in. And then the last one there is to just, you know, you may have varying response rates based on who you're talking to for that survey. So, you know, if we want to talk to people that didn't use Roku channel in the last 90 days, or we want to talk to a Hispanic population who we've observed has a much lower response rate to email, you know, you have to make sure you're factoring those in when you're pulling your sample populations, and knowing that you're going to be talking to a harder to reach audience. You may need to pull a larger list to accommodate for that lower response rate. So those are all different factors that like are important to consider when you're building out these programs. And of course, as you go through this process, you know, we're constantly learning still and constantly like refining our policies and refining our processes to improve and get better, because we send out a new survey internationally, and in Germany we see a different dynamic than we saw in the US. And so we have to change things accordingly. So it's really important that, you know, it's not a rigid process, that you set up best practices, but that, you know, as you go through this process, you continue to learn and continue to get better. So let's open it up for some questions.
All right, we have a question from Heidi. She asks, what response rates do you generally expect from email invite surveys? And is there a better time or day to send an invite for your users?
Yeah, that's a great question. So generally speaking, we do see that between 1% to 2% response rate without any incentive. And it's pretty standard. I have had it go as high as 2.5. I've had it go as low as 0.5%. As I alluded to, actually, that Hispanic survey that I sent of Hispanic users, that was actually like 0.5% response rate. So I ended up boosting that sample. So it can vary based on who you're talking to, but 1 to 2 is what you generally expect. As far as when to send, I find sending during weekdays is better. And then I also find, as far as time of day, either having it be the first thing in your inbox, so sending it out at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. East Coast time. Often, because I'm on the West Coast here, I'll queue it up to be sent out for the next day. But sending it out either first thing, so it's at the top of their inbox when they wake up in the morning, or sending it out around, in the kind of that prime time of the 5 to 7 p.m. Is where I tend to see maximal response rates. Sending over weekends, sending over holidays in particular, are definitely where you see much lower response rates.
Absolutely. Okay. Do we have any other questions? You can type them in the Q&A. We'll give them just a minute to see if anybody else has any questions.
Of course.
But we are butting up on time, so
That's great.
Yeah. Good timing on that, Alex.
I practiced.
All right. I don't see anyone typing anything. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Alex, thank you very much. That was a great step-by-step on that whole process of integrating the two from internal data and primary research.
Thank you so much.
I am
It was a pleasure.